The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber grew completely quiet while Jasmine Crockett positioned the microphone before herself. The newly elected representative from Texas maintained a straight posture in her flawlessly ironed maroon outfit, while directly opposite her, Senator Ted Cruz leafed through his documents, possessing the tranquil confidence of a man who seldom experienced loss within that room. The events that unfolded shortly after, though, were destined to serve as an unforgettable historical milestone. Prior to continuing, please remember to hit the like button and follow this channel to ensure you catch crucial legislative interactions similar to the exchange you are preparing to watch. This is important since the upcoming segment features a remarkably rare occurrence that left Ted Cruz entirely devoid of words. The atmosphere inside the chamber was palpably thick with unmissable friction. Cruz had previously talked over Crockett on 5 separate occasions throughout her introductory statements regarding election access laws, with every single disruption acting significantly more condescending than the prior one. Every person present could easily predict a 6th interjection was imminent, yet Crockett remained fully prepared. What initially appeared to function as a routine congressional procedure was on the verge of transforming into an incredibly widely discussed verbal battle of the entire calendar year. Senator Cruz, Crockett initiated, projecting a stable and determined vocal tone. I have tallied your outbursts today at 5 thus far, so we shall discover if you reach 7 prior to me concluding my explanation regarding why your positions are both incorrect and thoroughly misguided. The spectators rustled in their seats as broadcast lenses pivoted to record all perspectives, while the live viewership on C-SPAN skyrocketed practically overnight. The confident exterior displayed by Cruz started to falter, ultimately being substituted by an incredibly uncommon sense of authentic uneasiness. This event transcended the typical legislative gathering, marking the exact instance where Jasmine Crockett, a freshman lawmaker hailing from Dallas, achieved what numerous predecessors could not by confronting Ted Cruz in his primary domain with his personal tactics before a massive live television audience. In order to fully grasp the heavy significance of that dialogue, it is imperative to understand the backgrounds of these two specific political personalities. The rapid political ascension of Jasmine Crockett was certainly not a widely predicted outcome. Merely 24 months earlier, she worked as a civil rights lawyer operating in Dallas, handling difficult lawsuits that major corporate practices avoided, protecting individuals lacking financial resources for legal aid, and battling institutional bias one courtroom battle at a time. Upon declaring her congressional campaign, established political operatives brushed her aside, arguing that a youthful black woman originating from Texas would forever struggle to enact substantial legislative progress within the nation's capital. However, Crockett possessed absolutely zero desire to adhere to the traditional strategies, as she fully planned to draft an entirely new set of rules. Throughout her initial weeks serving in government, she labored without resting, thoroughly absorbing every single regulation and intricate bureaucratic procedure. While her colleagues delivered public addresses, she dedicated late evenings inside the Library of Congress to analyzing 50 years' worth of historical parliamentary records. She comprehended that fixing the governmental machinery required her to grasp its functions far more deeply than the very individuals who originally built it. Ted Cruz, conversely, perfectly represented the entrenched political elite, acting as a Princeton and Harvard law alumnus, previous Texas Solicitor General and veteran senator who constructed his public image upon cutting intelligence and absolute argumentative superiority. His signature tactic consisted of the perfectly executed interjection, deployed specifically to distract his adversaries, shatter their speaking flow, and command the overall direction of the conversation. For over a decade, he consistently leveraged this specific method with great success when facing experienced politicians, presidential cabinet members, and seasoned legislative scholars. This action functioned not merely as a subconscious tic, but rather as a meticulously designed battle plan, and throughout 15 years, literally nobody had successfully neutralized it. Yet the clash on that specific afternoon encompassed significantly more than the ballot access legislation, instead touching upon a much more profound underlying issue. It represented a fundamental conflict regarding which individuals possess the authority to vocalize their thoughts and which people are forcefully muted. The introduced statutory proposal sought to reinstate crucial electoral safeguards that had been systematically dismantled throughout the preceding 10 years. From the perspective of Cruz, fighting against the measure equated to preserving the structural electoral advantages held by his political faction within the state of Texas. From the perspective of Crockett, the objective centered on safeguarding her district's ability to participate, representing citizens who frequently waited in queues for prolonged periods simply to submit their electoral choices. Lying directly under the veneer of the legislative argument rested a more intense authority contest, pitting the entrenched old guard against newly rising political perspectives. The ultimate inquiry asked if the federal government would stay shackled by customary superiority and bureaucratic manipulation, or if a leader resembling Crockett could successfully disrupt that hierarchy. The formal committee inquiry had already been progressing for upward of 90 consecutive minutes. Senator Cruz remained in absolute authority, frequently speaking over testifiers, aggressively pivoting topics, and completely guiding each individual dialogue. Partisan loyalties proved irrelevant because whenever Cruz began talking, the entire chamber fell silent, establishing the standard behavioral expectation. Subsequently, the designated speaking period finally arrived for Representative Jasmine Crockett. She served as the final scheduled orator for the session, prompting numerous attendees to presume that Cruz might finally lessen his aggressive posture. Considering they both hailed from the state of Texas, a baseline level of professional politeness was broadly anticipated by the audience. Nevertheless, her remarkably calm demeanor seemed to deeply unnerve the veteran politician. She displayed zero subservience, completely bypassed the standard introductory flattery, and delivered her remarks with absolute certainty, acting as though her belonging in that room was beyond any dispute. Cruz immediately registered this distinct shift in behavioral dynamics. The initial disruptive interjection occurred merely 3 minutes into her allotted time frame. Crockett was detailing the negative impacts of voting center shutdowns across Texas when Cruz abruptly interceded by stating that Representative Crockett surely could not be implying such a thing. "Senator," she countered with a tranquil tone, "I am currently in the process of showcasing factual metrics, so I will address your inquiries upon my conclusion." Her vocal inflection remained perfectly courteous yet firmly commanding, causing numerous bystanders to swivel their necks in surprise. It was exceptionally uncommon for any individual to actively resist the very first disruption launched by Senator Cruz. He offered a grin, specifically the rehearsed variety he deployed whenever confronted, projecting a mixture of light entertainment and arrogant rejection. He reclined in his leather chair, feigning a tolerant attitude, yet his rhythmically drumming digits clearly exposed his underlying annoyance. Exactly 120 seconds afterward, the second conversational disruption predictably materialized. Crockett was displaying a geographic chart detailing ballot location eliminations when Cruz tilted aggressively forward to claim the statistics were heavily deceptive. "Senator Cruz," Crockett seamlessly inserted, "you will receive an ample opportunity to reply, but currently I am offering authenticated documentation that demands a complete hearing." She refrained from elevating her volume or even glancing upward, ensuring her delivery remained exceptionally balanced and deeply collected. The collective mood within the expansive room noticeably transformed. Legislative assistants immediately ceased swiping down the illuminated screens of their mobile devices. Fellow elected officials tilted their bodies closer to their desks, recognizing that a highly irregular event was actively transpiring. The verbal intrusions from Cruz generally functioned as mundane procedures that were widely anticipated, yet practically nobody ever publicly challenged them. The third disruption carried a harsher edge as Crockett analyzed election queuing durations, prompting Cruz's voice to slice across the space to declare the situation completely absurd and criticize her unilateral presentation. "Senator Cruz, that makes 3, Crockett articulated smoothly, her clear vocalization slicing neatly past his sentences as she lifted her eyes to lock onto his face, adding, "I am keeping a tally." "Nee." The chamber plunged into absolute stillness, given that absolutely no person had ever verbalized such a boundary previously. It constituted a relatively minor gesture, yet it managed to completely realign the entire power dynamic. She had successfully unmasked his combative tendencies in the immediate moment, making them blatantly obvious and completely impossible to refute. "I am merely attempting to guarantee factual correctness," Cruz responded defensively. "That is four," Crockett remarked, instantly proceeding with her testimony without skipping a single beat. The underlying friction permeating the hearing space intensified significantly. The presiding committee chairman, Dick Durbin, appeared visibly hesitant, struggling to determine whether he ought to officially intercede. However, Crockett had not breached any established parliamentary guidelines, remaining entirely peaceful, straightforward, and incredibly accurate. Regardless, every single attendee could tangibly feel the fundamental distribution of authority shifting before their eyes. The fifth conversational breach arrived carrying a notably altered vocal inflection. Cruz dropped his volume in an effort to appear restrained, suggesting that Representative Crockett should provide clarification for the benefit of everyone present. "Five," she audibly documented while simultaneously scratching a mark onto her printed materials. "Senator Cruz, that equals 5 intrusions within 10 minutes. I am simply wondering if that constitutes a legislative high score or just your individual peak." Gentle chuckling cascaded throughout the formal space, and an individual situated in the rear actually applauded briefly prior to being silenced. The facial features of Cruz visibly contracted, signaling his acute awareness of being cornered. He could either interject anew and validate her observation, or remain quiet and forfeit his dominance. Ultimately, he found himself utterly incapable of restraining his own impulses. While Crockett initiated reading constituent declarations, Cruz tilted toward his microphone once more to argue that those personal stories fail to characterize the whole. "6," Crockett announced assertively as she deliberately placed her documents flat upon the desk. The entire assembly essentially turned to solid ice. "Senator Cruz, you have currently spoken over me 6 times, and prior to you hitting 7, I desire for you to understand my level of readiness." She retrieved a distinct binder and hoisted a thick pile of printed records into the air. "I possess the official logs from the preceding 15 panel sessions you participated in. Do you wish to discover your frequency of interrupting women testifiers versus men?" Cruz fluttered his eyelids rapidly, yet maintained complete verbal silence. "The exact proportion sits at 4-to-1, meaning you cut off females quadruple the amount you do males, and you disrupt black females 6 times as often, especially black women hailing from Texas." She hesitated for a brief fraction of a second before concluding that she was definitively not his initial target. The chamber hummed with sudden energy as aides started aggressively mashing their keyboards, and a quiet voice murmured that the moment was destined for internet fame. Cruz appeared genuinely shell-shocked, his usual swagger evaporating as he parted his lips to speak before immediately shutting them tight. "That represents an unjust portrayal," he mumbled under his breath. "Is that so?" Crockett countered while casually turning over a new sheet of paper. "On January 15th, you talked over Professor Angela Davis 17 times over 30 minutes. On February 3rd, Dr. Stiti. Patricia Williams suffered 12 disruptions, and on March 27th, Representative Nicole Collier endured 21 interruptions. Do you want me to keep reading?" The natural pigment entirely exited Cruz's cheeks as his practiced unflappability finally fractured. Absolutely nobody would maintain eye contact with him, not even his partisan allies. Senator John Kennedy focused intensely upon his mug of dark roast, while Senator Josh Hawley directed his gaze straight toward the plaster ceiling. "This constitutes a coordinated trap," Cruz ultimately managed to utter. "Negative, Senator," Crockett answered steadily. "A trap involves cutting off an individual 6 times during their delivery of authenticated facts, whereas my current action is classified as thorough readiness, which is a distinct concept." She pivoted her attention back toward her presentation graphics, even though every spectator realized this confrontation remained far from concluded. The interior space practically vibrated with unease as the broadcasting lenses magnified the features of Cruz, which were twitching with obvious aggravation. Now, as I was mentioning prior to the sixth disruption, Crockett resumed flawlessly, the metrics unambiguously demonstrate a persistent trend of ballot access denial, most notably within Houston County. Cruz struggled immensely to restrain his tempers because sacrificing dominance openly and being actively tallied for his outbursts proved too heavy for his pride to bear. His entire political brand relied heavily upon supreme command, yet pure arrogance pushed him to continue escalating. He angled his body toward his audio receiver once again, utilizing a heavily sarcastic vocal delivery to assert that Representative Crockett's minor theatrical display might charm her social media fans, but it lacked substance. 7. The numerical declaration bounced powerfully off the acoustic walls of the chamber. Crockett rose to her feet with deliberate slowness, moving adjacent to her desk to ensure the entire audience possessed an unobstructed view of her posture. The lack of noise became profound, to the point where even the ambient mechanical drone seemingly vanished entirely. "Senator Cruz," she commenced with absolute resolve, "you have currently disrupted me 7 distinct times, 7 times you attempted to silence me, and 7 times you sought to prevent the citizens of this nation from learning the reality regarding our home state." She depressed the button on a handheld controller, prompting a multimedia clip to materialize on the screen behind her back, showcasing Cruz giving a speech at a recent public gathering. The extreme liberal factions, his digitized vocals resonated loudly, desire to mute right-leaning perspectives since they fail to triumph using concepts, they attempt to block our ability to talk. Crockett temporarily halted the playback and remarked smoothly that it was a fascinating ideology, asking the senator to clarify what precise action he was currently engaged in. The environment stayed perfectly motionless, leaving the mechanical whir of the climate control systems and a handful of nervous exhales as the solitary noises. Cruz remained rigidly seated in his chair, trapped halfway between sheer rage and stunned incredulity, producing an expression that photojournalists subsequently identified as the exact second he comprehended his total loss of the storyline. Nevertheless, Crockett had not yet concluded her calculated offensive. "Are you aware of the genuine problem, Senator?" Munshi proceeded, pacing methodically adjacent to the wooden panels resembling a trial attorney. "You have executed this tactic for such an extended period that you are completely blind into it now. The perpetual disruptions, shouting down other individuals, and disregarding perspectives that differ from your own have simply morphed into second nature." She engaged the clicker device an additional time, initiating a rapid video compilation displaying Cruz talking over testifiers throughout past sessions, targeting females, minorities, advocates, and elderly citizens. In rapid succession, his distinct timbre sliced across their testimonies, insisting that their claims were incorrect, that they misinterpreted his logic, that he needed to clarify their own words, or that their statements were blatantly false. The compiled segments generated an almost musical cadence of consistent conversational blockages. Following the conclusion of the video, a noticeable sense of discomfort washed over multiple political allies of Cruz. Senator Susan Collins aggressively dragged her pen across her notepad, while Senator Mitt Romney shielded his lips with his hand, although his eyes clearly broadcasted his judgment. Exceeding 143 deliberate disruptions across a half-year period, Crockett recited from her prepared documentation, which mathematically equates to a single outburst for every 12 minutes of sworn statements. Yet whenever major corporate chief executives provide answers, the frequency plummets to 1 disruption per 45 minutes, and when petroleum industry leaders take the microphone, it falls to once an hour. However, whenever the witness chair contains an individual possessing my demographics, the rate spikes to a disruption every 3 minutes. Cruz ultimately broke his silence, claiming that the presentation amounted to a deliberate destruction of his personal reputation. "Negative, Senator," Crockett answered with supreme emotional control. "It is purely a matter of numerical data. Statistics cannot deceive anyone because they possess zero partisan inclination. They merely expose reality, and that reality highlights an obvious and irrefutable behavioral cycle." She retreated in the direction of her designated chair, but refrained from taking a seat, choosing instead to pry open an incredibly dense document portfolio. Would you care to learn what additional findings my investigative efforts revealed, Senator? Cruz intensified his clutch upon the wooden rim of his workstation, causing the skin across his joints to turn completely white. This topic deviates entirely from the core purpose of this committee gathering, he declared with extreme harshness. Oh, but it absolutely aligns, Crockett interjected, seizing the conversational initiative for her very first time. This congressional assembly revolves around electoral access, determining which citizens receive a platform and which are muted, and you, Senator Cruz, have perfectly demonstrated the mechanics of that exact muting process. She flipped back the cover of her binder, proposing they analyze his official legislative actions regarding ballot-oriented statutes. During 2019, you registered a nay regarding the Voting Rights Advancement Act. In 2020, you stood against the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And throughout 2021, you struck down the For the People Act. Furthermore, amid the panel discussions surrounding those specific laws, you talked over the testifiers advocating for them at a mean rate of 8 separate instances per speaker. Those legislative proposals represented clear instances of national government overstepping, Cruz initiated his defense. However, Crockett sliced through his explanation with absolute firmness, informing the senator that she had not yet concluded her remarks. I did not travel to this chamber to engage in a shouting match. I arrived to provide factual proof demonstrating that you have reliably labored to complicate the electoral process while simultaneously degrading or silencing the individuals actively highlighting those burdens. And she spread out a massive geographic diagram of Texas, directing her finger toward highlighted districts, explaining that those represented the exact regions experiencing voting center shutdowns. Your political war chest accepted financial contributions from the precise groups that aggressively petitioned for those identical shutdowns. Does that strike you as a random alignment of events? Cruz elevated himself from his chair with sudden force, declaring that he possessed no obligation to remain seated while enduring such unfounded allegations. Then refuse to remain seated, Crockett countered with a piercing tone. Remain upright and face proper accountability. Remain standing and justify to the citizens of Texas why they must endure an 8-hour queue simply to cast a ballot, and confidently inform them exactly why their perspectives carry less weight than your financial backers. The legislative space suddenly surged with kinetic energy, prompting assistants to rise to their feet to secure better sightlines, while the C-SPAN broadcasting equipment toggled rapidly back and forth between the two politicians. Across digital platforms, the specific phrase regarding the 7 interruptions had already achieved massive viral momentum. Cruz, forcefully extracting tactics from his extensive background in adversarial rhetoric, desperately attempted to claw back his lost authority. Representative Crockett, he projected, your theatrical behavior this afternoon perfectly illustrates the fundamental cancer-afflicting contemporary governance. Rather than analyzing legitimate civic strategies, you are manufacturing an outrageous circus, aggressively pandering for internet engagement while dedicated lawmakers endeavor to execute actual governance. This dynamic precisely explains why newly elected officials must practice how to do exactly what, Senator? Crockett inserted with total calm. Practice how to remain mute, practice how to swallow relentless disruptions, or practice how to accept their subservient position. She elevated her cellular device so the entire gallery could observe it, directly asking the senator if he comprehended what the object represented. This device acts as the ultimate embodiment of a democratic republic operating in the 21st century. At this exact second, upwards of 3 million citizens are streaming this broadcast simultaneously, actively witnessing your abusive treatment of individuals possessing the courage to oppose your viewpoints. 3 million registered electors are observing your authentic feelings regarding their fundamental privilege to participate in the civic dialogue as it happens. She rested the mobile hardware back upon the desk surface and hoisted a single concluding piece of paper. This specific item, she explained with measured inflection, constitutes a formal declaration endorsed by every single Democratic representative serving within the Texas state legislature. Cruz remained entirely mute, holding his upright position while his physical bearing visibly deteriorated, his traps carrying massive tension, his cheeks burning red, and his trademark swagger dissolving rapidly. This written statement, Crockett pushed forward, communicates their unified backing for sweeping national election access statutes. They have personally witnessed the disastrous fallout when those crucial civil safeguards evaporate into thin air. They have grown completely exhausted by constantly observing their local voters enduring systematic institutional muting. And finally, allow me to read their exact phrasing. We stand firmly beside Representative Crockett while she delivers reality to the powerful, regardless of the sheer volume of disruptions she faces. A thunderous wave of clapping immediately exploded throughout the cavernous hearing space. The ovation extended far beyond liberal politicians, encompassing legislative aides, journalists, and actually drawing in a handful of the uniformed protective detail. The deafening noise saturated the entire hall while Chairman Durbin aggressively hammered his wooden mallet, desperately fighting to reinstate official decorum. Cruz forcefully angled his body toward his audio pickup, screaming over the massive din that the spectacle constituted a blatant breach of parliamentary procedure, loudly insisting that Chairman Durbin take action. 8. Crockett slipped into the acoustic chaos flawlessly. A wave of chuckles immediately trailed her comment, lacking any cruel mockery but instead carrying a deep understanding that surfaces when reality proves completely inescapable. Cruz locked up completely, utterly stripped of his ability to form words. Following a prolonged hesitation, he aggressively collected his files, rotated his body, and marched directly out the exit. The massive wooden barrier crashed shut in his wake, sending a loud reverberation bouncing across the spacious interior. Press photography strobes fired rapidly, mobile devices continued capturing footage, and the gallery remained seated in absolute shock, fully comprehending they had just observed a historical clash destined for digital immortality. Crockett patiently bided her time for the environment to settle before reinitiating her vocal delivery. Mr. Chairman, she stated with supreme professionalism, I wish to proceed with my electoral access lecture without facing further disruption, which ought to require roughly 10 minutes. Durbin, who continued to appear noticeably rattled by the exchange, offered an affirmative head bob and granted the speaker permission to advance. Just prior to her resuming the testimony, Senator Elizabeth Warren elevated herself from the rear seating arrangement and initiated a highly intentional rhythmic ovation. Incrementally, additional members contributed to the applause, pulling in progressives, unaffiliated politicians, and, remarkably, a small contingent of conservatives. A massive psychological and political realignment had clearly materialized within those specific walls. Once the percussive appreciation eventually subsided, Crockett immediately re-engaged with her prepared remarks. For a full 10 minutes free of any verbal blockades, she showcased her investigative data with exceptional lucidity and sharp exactness. Absolutely nobody dared to interject while she commanded the floor. Upon completing her final sentence, she consolidated her physical documents and proceeded in the direction of the main exit. Just moments before crossing the threshold, she pivoted back toward the dais, carrying a subtle grin on her face. Oh, regarding Senator Cruz's total disruption tally for this afternoon, that figure actually falls short of his typical statistical mean. During the previous calendar year, he talked over Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee 14 times within a 20-minute window, meaning today technically qualifies as behavioral improvement. The assembly erupted into widespread amusement once more while she departed the chamber, her shoe heels ringing sharply against the polished stone flooring. In her immediate absence, the legislative body vibrated with manic adrenaline as the confrontation was already saturating various online networking platforms. Before 60 minutes had elapsed, her sworn declaration transformed into the most heavily viewed parliamentary session ever broadcast throughout the entire history of C-SPAN. Journalistic publications swiftly branded the incident as the legendary 7 outbursts recognized across the globe. Governmental strategists characterized the event as one of the most devastatingly successful verbal dismantlings of an entrenched incumbent ever captured on live television. However, the genuine triumph resided not within the dramatic clash itself, but rather within the substantive ripples that emerged in its wake. The metrics, investigative labor, and core logic regarding systemic ballot restrictions that Crockett introduced completely monopolized the nationwide news cycle. The broader civic dialogue forcefully pivoted away from individual political celebrities and zeroed in directly on the fundamental policy dispute. Cruz attempted rapid reputation management, distributing a press release that charged Crockett with manufacturing an internet-famous circus act rather than concentrating on legislative substance. Yet his defensive maneuver was swiftly buried underneath freshly circulated archived video segments, showcasing him routinely talking over female speakers during historical panel gatherings. A massively shared video montage labeled to highlight his decade-long habit of cutting off women accumulated upwards of 50 million unique plays across a single 24-hour span. Even a contingent of his conservative peers initiated a subtle campaign to physically and politically separate themselves from his collapsing brand. Senator John Cornyn ranked among the earliest defectors, explicitly informing journalists that every individual possesses a fundamental right to deliver their committee testimony free from gratuitous conversational blockades. Senator Lisa Murkowski opted for a significantly blunter assessment, asserting that the public confrontation they witnessed that afternoon was massively delayed in its arrival. However, the most shocking reaction materialized courtesy of former Republican Senator Bob Corker, who published a digital statement noting his 6-year tenure alongside Cruz and praising Representative Crockett for executing the exact maneuver countless colleagues lacked the bravery to attempt. The political triumph secured by Crockett remained completely indisputable, although she deliberately sidestepped any form of self-congratulatory behavior. Throughout every subsequent press appearance, she consistently steered the spotlight straight back toward the foundational topic of universal ballot access. While conversing with Jake Tapper on CNN, she declared that the situation extended far beyond her personal conflict with any individual, remaining strictly focused on safeguarding the vocal empowerment of every single American citizen. She further noted that the genuine objective centered on guaranteeing equitable ballot access for all citizens, asserting that if exposing his disruptions forced the masses to recognize that reality, the resulting drama carried immense value. The subsequent shockwaves generated by the event, famously dubbed the 7 Interruptions hearing, cascaded rapidly across the entirety of the American legislative landscape. Before 24 hours had fully elapsed, the confrontation had transcended strict governmental boundaries to firmly plant itself within mainstream societal entertainment. The specific digit 7 transformed into a massive cultural joke, spontaneously manifesting during business conferences, holiday dinners, and informal chats the precise moment any individual attempted to speak over another. The comedic cast of Saturday Night Live broadcasted multiple parody routines surrounding the dispute, while Stephen Colbert devoted a full opening television monologue strictly to analyzing the verbal warfare. The truly substantial evolution nonetheless materialized deep within the actual halls of the Capitol building. The following morning, amidst a gathering of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Rand Paul initiated an interruption against a speaker before abruptly freezing and offering an apology alongside a request for the guest to proceed. Throughout the entire Washington metropolitan area, visiting experts and citizens providing testimony began logging a highly noticeable behavioral pivot. The official legislative inquiries progressively adopted a significantly more dignified and courteous atmosphere. Absolutely no elected official harbored the slightest desire to morph into the next iteration of Ted Cruz. Representative Jasmine Crockett rapidly ascended to superstar status, yet she bypassed the traditional avenues typically associated with governmental fame. She flatly refused to aggressively hunt for the spotlight, opting instead to leverage her newfound visibility with heavy tactical precision. Throughout each individual television or radio booking, she forcefully navigated the dialogue straight back toward the mechanics of ballot availability. During her segment on The Daily Show, when prompted to discuss the viral spat, she immediately pivoted to feature a visual schematic detailing heavily restricted voting centers. While appearing on The View, she physically escorted 5 separate Texas residents onto the set who had suffered direct electoral disenfranchisement. The raw, analytical metrics painted an incredibly vivid picture of her success. The C-SPAN network, which historically pulled roughly 300,000 watchers for typical proceedings, tracked upward of 45 million combined impressions of that specific argument across various digital mediums. Internet queries seeking information regarding electoral reform statutes skyrocketed by 3,000%, while community organizers established more than 400 local public forums dedicated to ballot entry throughout the country. Youthful citizens who possessed zero prior history of consuming parliamentary broadcasts found themselves suddenly reciting obscure procedural bylaws from memory. Concurrently, Ted Cruz collided violently with a paradigm he almost never previously experienced, which took the form of genuine consequences. Even deeply loyal partisan comrades within the conservative bloc commenced a rapid political retreat away from his radioactive presence. During a closed-door Republican strategy session, Cruz attempted to validate his combative methods, only to run face-first into an environment that one peer labeled as freezing Arctic silence. Senator John Kennedy, representing Louisiana, broke down the dynamic with extreme brevity, simply stating that an individual stuck at the bottom of a pit ought to drop their shovel. Cruz had essentially lugged far more than mere debate rhetoric into that hearing room. He had driven a massive industrial digger straight into the chamber and subsequently entombed himself. Massive institutional financiers monitored the entire collapse, which it's always my extreme intersomil by Mrs. A trio of titanic business conglomerates headquartered in Texas that historically funded his campaigns publicly declared a comprehensive audit of their ongoing political investments. A leading executive commanding a major oil firm admitted to the Wall Street Journal under the condition of anonymity that they financially back lawmakers capable of powerfully advancing their corporate agenda and suffering total humiliation at the hands of a first-term representative on live television utterly fails that effectiveness test. The most devastating blowback, nevertheless, originated directly from within the borders of his home state of Texas. Merely 72 hours following the combative panel, a comprehensive regional survey revealed that the public approval metrics for Cruz had plummeted by 12 full points. Providing an even more shocking data point, exactly 67% of conservative Texas voters indicated they felt profound humiliation regarding his public conduct. While attending a previously scheduled community forum located in Houston, Cruz endured heavy verbal abuse originating from his own reliable voting base. The exact instant he attempted to loudly interrupt a local resident inquiring about medical coverage, an audience member bellowed from the crowd that the disruption counted as number one. The gathered citizens erupted into mocking laughter, prompting Cruz to completely abandon the venue after surviving a mere 20 minutes. Simultaneously, the opposing liberal political apparatus in Texas logged unprecedented surges regarding both grassroots volunteer enlistments and incoming financial contributions. Beto O'Rourke, who suffered a razor-thin defeat against Cruz back in 2018, utilized social media to proclaim that Jasmine Crockett achieved within 18 minutes what he personally failed to accomplish across 18 months, which was exposing the authentic nature of Ted Cruz to the entire state. Even strictly conservative operatives discovered themselves engaging in deep institutional soul-searching. Senator Marco Rubio expressed to Politico that lawmakers absolutely must improve their capacity to allow citizens to finish their statements, particularly during moments of fierce ideological friction. He added that the visual imagery of talking over testifiers, most notably females and marginalized demographics, looks disastrous and is fundamentally inappropriate. Shortly thereafter, the upper chamber's procedural governing body convened a rapid crisis session to actively debate implementing strict boundaries regarding verbal intrusions during sworn depositions. Senator Amy Klobuchar formally pitched a mandate that quickly earned the moniker of the Crockett Rule, which legally required that guest speakers receive the absolute right to conclude their introductory declarations free from any external interference. The regulatory adjustment secured unanimous approval, with Cruz ironically casting an affirmative vote, despite opting out of physically attending the actual legislative gathering. 14 days later, massive forward velocity reattached itself to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, a bill that previously sat frozen in bureaucratic limbo for an extended period. A trio of conservative lawmakers publicly declared their backing for an updated draft of the sweeping civil rights legislation. Senator Murkowski pointedly referenced the dramatic exchange facilitated by Crockett as her primary catalyst for change. She elaborated that the hard metrics presented by Representative Crockett proved the nation required solemn negotiations concerning ballot entry rather than cheap partisan stagecraft. Crockett simultaneously managed her freshly acquired legislative leverage with incredibly delicate precision. She aggressively dodged media saturation, rejecting the vast majority of journalistic interview requests to permanently fixate on forging powerful alliances across the Capitol. She held covert strategy sessions alongside right-leaning Texas lawmakers, successfully mapping out overlapping goals regarding civic construction projects and military veteran welfare. She explicitly informed her administrative team that she avoided traveling to Washington simply to achieve internet stardom, but rather arrived with the sole intention of executing tangible progress. The cultural shockwave completely bypassed strict governmental limits, bleeding deeply into corporate America as female professionals initiated aggressive resistance against being talked over during business conferences. The Harvard Business Review printed a comprehensive analysis titled "The Crockett Effect" regarding how numerical tallying alters dialogue, highlighting a 40% reduction in conversational hijacking within environments where the viral clash was actively discussed. Academic institutions integrated the specific confrontation into their syllabi for advanced governmental messaging and executive management seminars. A highly credentialed Georgetown academic branded the event as the ultimate demonstration of intense readiness colliding with golden opportunity, dissecting Crockett's rhythmic delivery, vocal inflection, and evidentiary deployment on a second-by-second basis. On an international scale, the explosive interaction struck a massive collective nerve. The BBC broadcasted a dedicated feature examining legislative verbal dismantlings, while a serving British Member of Parliament utilized social media to confess she was actively recording tactics, crowning the display as American governmental drama operating at its absolute peak. Exactly 90 days later, as the ballot protection measure finally hit the floor for formal tallying, a truly unprecedented historical anomaly unfolded. Senator Ted Cruz formally abstained from the entire legislative process. He refused to endorse the proposal, yet he similarly declined to reject it, allegedly maneuvering to dodge a secondary humiliating television battle against Crockett, who was slated to deliver additional testimony. The civil rights legislation successfully cleared the final hurdle by a razor-thin margin of merely 2 individual yeas. During the official executive ratification event, President Biden explicitly requested that Crockett position herself directly adjacent to his desk while he inked the paperwork. He quietly muttered a comment regarding the 7 disruptions, noting that despite his multi-decade tenure occupying the Senate, he had never once witnessed a spectacle resembling that exact caliber of pushback. Crockett offered a gentle grin, remaining perfectly emotionally anchored. The monumental occasion possessed absolutely nothing to do with her individual ego, but rather centered entirely upon millions of marginalized citizens finally securing unobstructed entry to their local voting centers. Regardless, she permitted her own mind a solitary, fleeting second of profound personal gratification. While she departed the historic gathering, a journalist shouted an inquiry asking if Representative Crockett possessed any lingering statements meant specifically for Senator Cruz. She halted her momentum, produced a faint smirk, and announced her genuine desire that he had finally absorbed the reality that every single perspective warrants a proper audience. The aggressive correspondent pushed further, demanding to know if she truly believed his mindset had evolved. Crockett seamlessly retorted by highlighting that the man had been remarkably silent during the recent legislative stretch. She concluded that such behavioral restraint served as an excellent foundational beginning. The massive cultural crater generated by the viral collision survived well past the initial media cycle. Academic literature dedicated to governmental strategy officially integrated the verbal duel as a mandatory educational module concerning highly lethal public messaging. A professional nonfiction film crew shadowed Crockett constantly over a 12-month span, ultimately manufacturing a cinematic feature that captured an Emmy victory. Cruz desperately executed aggressive reputation laundering tactics, embarking upon a statewide listening expedition throughout Texas, aggressively suppressing his urge to talk over citizens, retaining entirely fresh public relations personnel, and even deploying self-deprecating humor at a banquet by claiming he forcefully mastered counting to 7. However, during absolutely every subsequent panel discussion that followed the disaster, an invisible audience was relentlessly tracking his outbursts. Exactly 365 days following the incident, during the lavish Washington Press Club gala, Crockett formally accepted the trophy, honoring the most impactful governmental confrontation of the calendar cycle. Throughout her acceptance address, she noted that the public frequently inquires whether she mapped out the trap, clarifying that while she rigorously readied her data, genuine emotional lightning remains entirely impossible to artificially manufacture. She emphasized that a leader can solely focus on maintaining absolute readiness for the exact second destiny knocks on the door. She asserted that Senator Cruz accidentally provided her with a golden platform to broadcast what countless millions endure constantly: the heavy burden of being systematically muted, aggressively shouted down, and casually discarded. She allowed a heavy silence to hang in the air before wrapping up her speech by stating that occasionally, the absolute most devastating weapon an individual can wield is simply keeping a tally. She urged the crowd to mathematically track the conversational violations, the missing ballots, the permanently locked voting facilities, and the grueling hours citizens suffer in endless queues merely to register their political preference. She demanded that organizers forcefully drag these hidden injustices completely into the harsh light of day. She concluded that such relentless illumination acts as the sole mechanism for driving systemic evolution, advancing forward one solitary digit after another. The massive ballroom erupted into unified cheers, and miraculously a select few conservatives actually joined the ovation. Senator Cruz noticeably failed to occupy a seat at his designated table. His total physical evasion communicated a massive narrative all by itself. While Crockett descended the wooden staircase attached to the podium, a youthful legislative apprentice intercepted her path. "Representative Crockett, I wish to express my deepest gratitude," the junior staffer began. "I suffer from constant conversational hijacking during my office strategy sessions," she confessed. "However, I now actively maintain a running numeric tally," she added proudly. "Possessing that hard mathematical data arms me with actual tangible leverage," the young woman declared. Crockett beamed with pride, replying that the beautiful aspect of keeping score is its universal accessibility, requiring nothing beyond sheer mental focus and an absolute refusal to be forcefully muted. The massive secondary shockwaves refused to dissipate. Prestigious academic researchers instituted a formal disruption barometer, calculating the precise frequency at which politicians talked over guests while cross-referencing demographic variables like sex, ethnicity, and generation. The resulting analytical discoveries directly sparked immense institutional overhauls back down within the state of Texas. Citizen electoral enrollment skyrocketed by an incredible 23% throughout the specific municipal districts suffering the harshest voting center eliminations. A wave of youthful politicians, deeply energized by Crockett's viral masterclass, launched aggressive campaigns utilizing the official rallying cry that absolutely every vocalization warrants tracking. A prominent local news organization, the Texas Tribune, debuted a dedicated investigative series titled Beyond 7, extensively chronicling the massive societal realignment triggered by the initial clash. Cruz ultimately distributed a formal declaration stating he possessed zero intention of pursuing another Senate term, publicly blaming a desire to chase fresh professional horizons. Nevertheless, deeply entrenched Capitol operatives fully recognized that his once fearsome governmental authority had totally evaporated. Despite this reality, the ultimate historical footprint left by the battle did not center on the spectacular professional collapse of Ted Cruz. The genuine achievement rested entirely upon the fundamental evolution of civic conversation itself. Official legislative assemblies evolved into vastly more dignified environments where guest speakers retained the right to conclude their thoughts. The specific vocal demand to allow an individual to finish speaking rapidly morphed into a standard parliamentary battle cry. Exactly 5 years following the clash, Crockett took the official oath of office to serve as a United States Senator representing Texas, absolutely crushing Cruz's handpicked replacement by a staggering 15-point margin. While pondering the foundational moment during an interview with the New York Times, she admitted that she never harbored long-term aspirations to function as the permanent scorekeeper of bad manners. She philosophized that occasionally destiny aggressively dictates your specific purpose on the global stage. Ted Cruz operated under the delusion that he was forcing me into submission. Conversely, he accidentally constructed a massive megaphone for my cause, she explained. When pressed regarding whether she ever engaged in a private dialogue with Cruz following the disaster, Crockett offered a knowing grin. She revealed that he initiated a telephone call roughly 12 months later in a desperate bid to neutralize the lingering hostility. I permitted him to ramble without resistance for 5 full minutes before I stated, "Senator, I find it necessary to talk over you right now," she recounted. She described a heavy pause on the cellular line before he finally conceded that he fully earned the retaliation. In a twist of deep irony, Cruz subsequently transitioned into academia, instructing a collegiate syllabus focused squarely upon dignified communication within the political arena. As Crockett marched onto the upper chamber floor to log her inaugural senatorial decision, she physically transported the exact same binder from that legendary encounter, still packed with historical logs and raw metrics. She lacked any practical requirement for the documents anymore, yet she adamantly refused to abandon them, understanding deeply that intense readiness extends far beyond simply winning temporary debates. It operates as the ultimate tool for permanently altering the underlying game mechanics. The legendary 7 verbal disruptions transcended fleeting digital fame, cementing themselves as a massive pivot point within American governmental history, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that authentic dominance does not belong to the loudest shouter, but rather to the individual who absolutely refuses to be muted. Jasmine Crockett accomplished vastly more than simply humiliating Ted Cruz. She fundamentally drafted an entirely new architectural blueprint regarding how marginalized perspectives forcefully project themselves into the halls of absolute authority, leaving behind a potent educational legacy to meticulously track the conversational disrespect, expose those transgressions to the blistering light of public scrutiny, and fiercely guarantee that absolutely nobody ever extinguishes your right to speak.